Hello, joyful warriors, and welcome to M4LU's monthly book club discussion. In April, we've been focusing on gender ideology, and as I've said at pretty much every event we've had so far, this was really the topic that started me down my rabbit hole of crazy, trying to understand just what exactly was happening in our society. Now, before we begin, I just want to welcome our guests to the call and also point out a couple of features. So you can see your chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Please use that to interact with the other guests and audience members, as well as to send your questions to Ryan. We will do our best to get to as many as we can throughout the call, but I do ask that you please be respectful and kind, because know that any inappropriate and rude behavior will get you removed from the event. And of course, finally, I must remind everyone that the opinions of our guests are always their own and may not necessarily reflect those of Moms for Liberty. So, as I previously said, April's focus has been gender ideology. The book club, is our third of four events. I really hope you are enjoying these events, getting value out of them, and feel like you're getting informed, equipped, and empowered to help you fight back against this horrific ideology that we're facing in society. Just a quick recap of some of the events we had. We had Gender 101 kicked off with that. We had Logan Lansing, who presented on queer theory. Mia Hughes talked about social contagion and the medical catastrophe that this gender ideology has foisted upon our population, really. And then finally, Colin Wright grounded us in reality by presenting on the binary of sex. Last week, we had Gender 102. That was our virtual discussion with Billboard Chris, who was fresh back from Australia and New Zealand, and Dr. Jay Richards from the Heritage Foundation. If you missed either of those events, I strongly encourage you to take a quick look over on our YouTube channel, the Moms for Liberty YouTube channel. If you search M4LU and then either Gender 101 or Gender 102, it should bring those right back up. So I'm super excited for today. We have our book club discussion, and we are going to be talking or reviewing this month's book, which is When Harry Became Sally. I absolutely loved the iconic movie that this is a fun little play on with When Harry Met Sally. So this book was just absolutely fantastic to read. And our guest today is the author, Ryan Anderson. He is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a prolific author with five influential books, including his latest, which is Tearing Us Apart: How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. His groundbreaking research has been cited by U.S. Supreme Court justices and featured in major media outlets like ABC, CNN, and Fox News. Princeton and Notre Dame graduate, Anderson's work spans prestigious publications and academic roles, making him a leading voice in political philosophy and social thought. So please help me welcome Ryan. We are so glad you're here.
Great. Pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So this book was really fantastic. I think the way that it first came onto my radar was when I heard that it was banned on Amazon. So I was like, wow, this has got to be something pretty crazy if it's getting banned on Amazon. So tell me, what got you started? What made you want to jump into this fight and write a book on gender ideology?
Sure. And it's funny that you mentioned that it was when it got canceled. I think this was the Streisand effect because at that point the book was 3 years old. Like the book had come
Oh,
out
wow.
February of 2018, and then it was February of 2021 that Amazon decided the book was now hate speech. And all that had changed in the meantime was that Donald Trump was no longer president. Bill Barr was no longer the attorney general. Josh Hawley was no longer in the Senate majority. He was in the minority. And so, it's just very interesting. And then it's amazing. It was then February of 2025. So, 3 months ago now that the book got unbanned. And what had
No, oh, it's
changed?
that
Trump was
long.
now president again. And, Pam Bondi was now the attorney general and Josh Hawley's in the Senate majority again. And so the book went from
Wow.
being not hate speech to being hate speech to being not hate speech again, all depending on whether or not Trump was in the White House and whether or not
Very
Amazon was.
telling.
Oh, of course. Because obviously the words on the page hadn't changed. It's all like whether or not they're going to open an antitrust investigation on Amazon or so anyway, it's been fascinating to watch. My publisher of the book, he laughed about it all the way to the bank because like there were all these people like you who heard about the book for the first time because it was banned, and so it sold more copies, and the publisher made more money. All right, but to actually answer your question, like how did this come about? Partly it's because of I joke. There's a great American political philosopher named Janis Joplin who said, "Freedom, just another word for nothing left to lose." And so I had been outspoken during the gay marriage debate, and at the very end of the gay marriage debate, I realized what was coming next, and it was the transgender debate, because the acronym had always been LGBT, and I think most of
Mhm.
us really had no idea what the T stood for. Like if you look in the
Yeah.
1990s, early 2000s, we had like a 20-year debate about gay marriage. And then all of a sudden, one night we woke up, and if we didn't think that trans rights were human rights, the way that Joe Biden and others described it, we were now on the wrong side of history. We were now bigots. And the way that I discovered this was it was April of 2015, maybe March of 2015, but it was on a Saturday night. I get a text message from George Stephanopoulos' producer, because I was going on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, his Sunday morning talk show, the next morning to talk about Obergefell, the Supreme Court
Oh,
case on
wow.
marriage. And he said, George wants to know if you can talk about Bruce Jenner's interview as well. And so I typed back on my thumbs, like, who's Bruce Jenner? Because I hadn't been keeping up with the Kardashians. And, that previous night, Friday night on 2020, he had done his famous interview where he told Diane Sawyer that he was a woman. And that was when I realized, oh, they know they're getting Anthony Kennedy's vote to redefine marriage. The LGBT activist groups, they're not going to declare victory, shut down, send the money back to their donors. They're going to pivot to the T part of the acronym. And so they redefined marriage. Now they're going to redefine sex as gender identity. So again, this is back like springtime of 2015. That's when I started to get to work on the book, When Harry Became Sally. I went home early from the wedding reception. I watched the interview. I like came up with my talking points because I knew I was going to be asked about this, the next morning. And that's when I said, oh, wow, like everyone else is going to duck and cover. And if you think about the history of this, at the time, even the Republican Party was afraid to talk about this. Even some of our
Hmm.
churches were afraid to talk about this, because the lesson that was learned up here was we were outspoken on the LGB, we were outspoken on the gay marriage debate, and we got our clock cleaned, right? We got our teeth kicked in. We're just going to keep our heads down. And so I think a lot of people, at least at first, were too timid. They were too fearful. I joke about the Janis Joplin lyric only because, like, look, I had everyone who could hate me already hated me. I had all of these both professional and personal enemies at this point. I had been disowned by my alma mater. Like I was like, I have nothing to lose. I have the freedom to write this book. And then 2 or 3 years later, Abigail Schreier writes her book, right? And then and then it snowballs.
Yeah.
And you could see a timeline in which Hillary Clinton wins the 2016 election, and all of the things that had taken place prior to that get solidified. They get kind of like sealed by the federal government. And had it not been for the Trump 1 administration and now Trump 2, I think this timeline could have played out very differently for those of us on the
Oh,
side
yeah.
of reality.
Yeah, I think it was so interesting. I think you do a really great job of, well, I forget the words you use in there in the book, but it's you're very uh gentle, I would say. Like you're cautious, not cautious, that's not the right word for it. But you're very empathetic. And you have it's a very kind approach to it. With the definition of love and kindness, really genuinely looking out for the best person's or
Yep.
the person's best interest in reality, right? And so that was something I really appreciated about the book, because this topic itself is very inflammatory.
Yeah.
I find now I've done tons of research on it for this month, and it's just incredible the arguments you hear on both sides. So it can be very hard to have that gentle conversation in the middle, and I think you do a really good job of that. One of the
Thank you.
things that I'm curious about, so you talk about the timeline leading up to it. So it seemed like this was a uniquely positioned time frame, like you talked about. Everything could have played out very differently if we didn't have the interruption of Trump in
Yeah.
our executive office. So What do you think specifically took root in culture? What people
Yeah.
contributed to this shift in the 10 years prior? What was it, just Hillary Clinton? I don't think it was, right? Like, what all led
No.
to that?
Well, no, and so what's interesting is that it's actually Obama to a great extent. Like his parting gift. It's in May of 2016. So the election's going to be November of 16. That was when his Department of Justice, his Department of Health and Human Services, and his Department of Education, particular focus for Moms for Liberty, all on the same day, they issued new guidance, regulations from HHS, Dear Colleague letters from DOE and DOJ, saying the word sex in federal civil rights law now means gender identity. And so what they were saying to every school in the nation, right? Every healthcare agency, doctor, hospital that's regulated under Obamacare, if you don't treat a boy who identifies as a girl as if he is a girl, you're violating his civil rights, right? So there's now a civil right to be treated in accordance with your internal sense of gender. And this meant, schools, bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams. This meant medical treatment, right? Insurance would have to pay for it. Doctors would have to do it. There were all of these religious liberty lawsuits. Again, like this is May of 16. Some of these, the new insurance regulations go into effect January 1 of 17. And then January 20th, Trump gets inaugurated. And then it's either February or March that Betsy DeVos and the first attorney general, I'm blanking on his name right now. He was the senator from Alabama. They issue their dear colleagues say, no, the word sex means sex, right? But you ask, like, what else takes place? So I think part of this was politics. This was imposed on us. It was not a bunch of soccer moms. It wasn't a bunch of moms for transgenderism, right? There's no counterpart to Moms for Liberty that were pushing for this. It was largely driven by the LGBT activist groups who, once they won on gay marriage, they were now going to pivot to the transgender part. It was power politics. Some of Obama's biggest donors, some of his bundlers were LGBT activists, many millionaires and some billionaires who are firmly in the LGBT advocacy lane. And I think these are some people who hadn't even thought about the transgender issue. They just knew that they were, quote, allies. And because they were allies on the LGB, they were allies on the T. I think some of this is just purely ideologically driven. And there are different ideological roots. If you can go all the way back to like the medieval time period with the rise of nominalism and voluntarism. But I think, more up close, this is to a certain extent the next rolling revolution of the sexual revolution. And so
Oh,
the idea was that consenting adults should do with their bodies whatever consenting adults want to do with their bodies, right? The original sexual revolution. Then it became consenting teenagers and kids should do with their body. Well, then it also became I should be able to be whoever I want to be with my sexual identity. And, first for adults, and then eventually we saw for children. And so you can see how there's a certain activist side, ideological side, political side. Also, I just think technology. When
yeah.
I was growing up, a bunch of these drugs and devices really didn't exist, right? And
Hmm.
so it's only with like the creation of and the perfection, but getting better at puberty blockade, cross-sex hormones, top surgery, bottom surgery. Right? There's a whole host of like technological developments that made this plausible. The first pediatric children's clinic opens in the United States in 2007. Right, so less than 20 years. Right, I mean that's how
Yeah.
recent this is. And then from 2007 until 2015, less than a decade to make it seem like this is a human rights issue where you and
Yeah.
I are human rights violators.
So I think one thing that I'm seeing now, and you touch on this in your book too, the idea that feminism, so we
Yep.
have these other movements, right? So there's feminism, there's the LGBT side or parts of LGBT, which now there's almost a distancing, I
Yeah.
think I'm seeing, because
Without a
people are
doubt.
like, wait a second, like that's not, that because it's really, I mean, there's a statement of what transing the gay away, this idea
Yep.
that, these kids would grow out of this mental confusion that they're having. And it's like it's now has almost felt like it's become an attack on the groups of womanhood. I still feel like it is in so many ways an attack on womanhood. And then also the idea of homosexuality. So you'd almost expect people to turn against it. Going back to feminism though, because I think that's an
Mhm.
interesting one. I think you talk about it as well, the idea of who is it, Bouvier, who says like
Yep.
becoming a woman. So do you think that feminists like that contributed to the transgender
Yeah.
movement?
Without a doubt. And I think it's chapter 7 in the book where I kind of go through some of that history. So let me say one thing about that, but also piggyback on what you just said about the LGB having a divorce from the T. I think you're
Yeah.
exactly right. Like, I think a lot of the activist groups, the professional kind of agitators, do not speak for your ordinary gay and lesbian American. And
Yeah.
so back, I've been at the Ethics and Public Policy Center for a little over 4 years. And so Jay Richards was my replacement at Heritage, and he's just done amazing work. So back when I had Jay's job at Heritage, I hosted some of these like left-leaning radical feminists, including the first lesbian who was reinstated to the military after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was lifted. And I'll never forget, one of the things she said when she spoke, she was like, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but thank you to the Heritage Foundation for giving me what no left-leaning organization would give me, a
Hmm.
platform. Right. And
That was
so,
so moving.
oh, it was amazing. I'm sitting there like, because there were two different events like that I had hosted. And I was like, one of the events. So that was the first event. The second event had this young lady. She was probably in her 20s, and she was kicked off of the Baltimore City LGBT Commission for saying only women could be lesbians, and they said she was transphobic. And so,
Wow.
what was fascinating about all of this is that there were both gay and lesbian voices and feminist voices who said, "Look, we're going to have to agree to disagree about all of this other stuff, but my being a feminist or my being a lesbian never caused tangible physical harm to a third party, right?
Yeah.
My being a lesbian never caused a 13-year-old girl to have a double mastectomy, right? It never caused a man to violate the privacy of a woman or a man to take a gold medal away from a woman, right? And so, like, there are all these ways in which we can say, look, we're going to agree to disagree about these other areas, but we can agree here. I think the title of the event was Biology is Not Bigotry. And we agree
Oh,
about biological reality. Um,
yeah.
all right. So that's just to say, like, I
No,
think it's
that's
been a
great.
good development that this did not get pigeonholed as just a conservative issue or just a
Yeah.
Christian issue. One of the events was titled Hands Across the Aisle because it had two conservative Christian women speakers and two like radical lefty women speakers. And they were like, look, we're going to reach across the aisle and we're going to agree to combat what's happening to our nation's young women in particular,
Hmm.
under the guise of gender ideology. Okay, you ask
It is.
about the second wave feminists. Simone de Beauvoir, she has that famous phrase where she says, "One is not born but becomes a woman."
Yeah,
And,
that's it.
and what the second wave feminists were trying to do was to drive a wedge between sex as merely biological and then gender as purely a social construct. And so they wanted to say was, look, there's this biology, like, yes, like men and women are different in this superficial way that one has an innie and one has an outie in essence. But everything else is a social construct. And so they wanted to divide sex from gender. All right, that sets the table in essence for then gender theorists to say, well, wait, if it's all a social construct, then gender identity is what actually matters, not mere biology, right? The biology is just kind of like the plumbing, and we can rearrange the plumbing to line up with the truth, which is like my inner sense, my gender sense. So what they did was they divided sex from gender, which then allowed the trans activists to then say, oh, and gender isn't a social construct, it's a personal construct. Each and every one of us has our own inner sense of gender, and it's this inner sense of gender that is determinative. And so that then allows, first the Obama administration, then the Biden administration, the state of California, New York, Illinois was actually, so it's interesting when you read through that, I think it's the second chapter of the book. You look at, it was the Obama administration working hand in glove with Illinois and California to
Hmm.
first impose some of these things in the early part of the Obama presidency. And then it gets nationwide imposed in that very last year of the Obama presidency. But it is like, it's some very bad, if first wave feminists were saying men and women should have equal rights, second
Hmm.
wave feminists were really saying there should be no differences between men and women. They were pushing what I refer to as an androgynous form of feminism. And I think we need to push
Interesting.
back on both, like, the men are from Mars, women are from Venus, like overly extreme stereotypes about men and women.
Hmm.
But I think we also need to push back on the idea that men and women are interchangeable, and that boys
Yeah.
and girls are, interchangeable. Like, there are differences that make a difference between boys and girls, men and women. And the virtuous mean is rejecting both overstated stereotypes and the androgyny that tries to say the plumbing doesn't matter.
I love that you talk about stereotypes there. I think that's been one of the most um It it's almost like it's an argument that people overlook or forget. They get so sucked up in this idea that, oh, love is love, which is not
Mm.
the exact statement, but this idea that you just have to affirm everything. That's the only way that you can be supportive is if you're affirming this lunacy. But
Yep.
the reality is it is, and Jay said it last week, it's so regressive.
Yep.
We made such progress truly, but now, oh, because a girl, which I was 100% a tomboy.
Yep.
I went through this phase in 6th grade where my parents probably thought I was wackadoodle because I wore baggy pants, and I think I even wore boxers for a while because that was like the cool thing to do.
Right.
It was not comfortable, by the way. So kudos to guys for whatever. But I mean, I went through all of this strange moment, and I mean, the fact that now it's so stereotyped that if you do that, you must, your
Mm.
entire inner self, your entire being is aligned to this stereotype. But somehow they don't see that as regressive, which
Yep.
is shocking to me. And it leads to my next question. So I think it's really interesting because in the trans moment, you see, which I love that you call it the transgender moment, by the
Moment.
way. I think that's cool. um it's, there's so many contradictions there, right? So we've
Mm.
got this idea that gender identity is immutable and can't be changed, but at the same time it's also super fluid and could change every hour. How do you fight back? How do you respond to this type of inconsistency, these illogical statements?
Yeah. So there's I forget which chapter it's in now, but there's a section of one of the chapters that I think it's titled like the philosophical contradictions of the transgender worldview, and then I published it as an essay online. And so part of it is just like to highlight all of the series of contradictions, because some of the activists, they want to have it both ways, right? They want to say
Yeah.
gender is culturally constructed, but also that there's an inner sense of gender. They want to say that it's a binary set of political and legal options, but it's also a fluid spectrum set of personal options. Right? There's a whole host of contradictions. And I think what's helpful is just exposing that for the ordinary person,
Hmm.
letting the ordinary person know that the emperor has no clothes. And this gets to your previous comment about how, for a lot of like contemporary feminists today, they're like, wait a minute, I spent so much of my adult life combating these sex
Yeah.
stereotypes, and now gender identity is based upon like reifying the stereotype. So that if
Yeah.
you're a girl who likes hunting in G.I. Joe, that means you're actually a boy trapped in a girl's body. And when Bruce becomes Caitlyn, he becomes a very stereotypical looking like fashion model, right? Which a lot of the feminists were like, wait, when I saw that cover picture on Vanity Fair, like that is sending certain signals about what a real woman is supposed to look like that we've been fighting against. Right. And so I think that was also helpful just to kind of like let people see that, wait, if you're not going to base sex, gender identity on the reality of the body, all that you're left with are stereotypes. Boys like blue, girls like pink. Boys like hunting, girls like ballet. Like my wife was a championship shotgun shooter on the Hillsdale shooting team. Right, we have this giant trophy
Wow.
in our house. Right, I mean, all of her sisters were raised like you, like tomboys. Like they went hunting with their father. thankfully, they all came of age before transgender ideology took root. Because like what we're doing right now is we're telling people that if you don't fit some narrow mold of what's expected of you as a real boy or a real girl, that means you're not a real boy or a real girl, right? And so like part of this should actually be being much more capacious in our understanding of what is socially acceptable for boys and girls to do. It's perfectly fine to be a girl who likes football and likes hunting. It's perfectly fine to be a boy who likes ballet or who likes art, like whatever it is. I mean, so I think, this can be a word of caution to, I think, some communities that are overly prescriptive in gender
Yeah.
norms, but that's also a mistake.
So I want this I think leads right into a thought that one thing I noticed you and we were talking about this a little bit before the show. Um, you talk about in the book the idea of there are definite there's scientific, there's definite differences between men and women. Obviously, the biology of sex with XX and XY chromosomes, but you get into DSDs, the
Yeah.
disorders, and I found some of them absolutely incredibly fascinating because the a lot of times trans activists will try to use the idea of intersex
Mhm.
as something to say that it's either a third sex. And you talk about as well, though, even a point where there could be multiple DNA with
Yeah. Yeah.
chimeras, I think it is, and mosaics.
Yep.
I mean, just absolutely fascinating, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a third sex. Can you
Yep.
just talk to that a little bit more about the science of it?
Yeah.
And how
So,
does that relate to the brain, by the way? That how does that relate to like, is there a male brain, a female brain?
yeah, I mean, yes and no to the brain part. Like, yes, only in the sense of that, like a male brain is the brain that a male has, but like male and female brains, if you were just like looking at them under a microscope or on a dissecting table, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell which is which because it's going to be an overlapping set of bell curves. And so there are differences on average between a male brain and a female brain, but there's also lots of similarities and overlap. And it's unclear, given just the reality of neuroplasticity, of like, how much of this is also the type of thing where my brain changes based upon my thoughts, my feelings, my actions. And so it's not necessarily that certain type of brain creates a certain type of personality, but also a certain type of personality then for reinforces a certain type of brain. Certain types of behaviors are both the cause and the effect of brain structure, right? So this is where like the plasticity of the brain creates much more of a two-way street. But it's wrong to suggest there's a brain sex, and therefore you could identify what your brain sex is and then say that's what the sex of the person is. There's no evidence to suggest that theory holds any water. All right, so the first part of your question is, all right, what is sex in the first place? And I imagine if you had Colin Wright on last week or the week before, he's done a great job addressing this. Like, you can think of why there's a sex binary, and so there are only two binary, and then why is it stable rather than being fluid, right? It doesn't change day to day, year to year, hour to hour, because there are two ways of being organized for sexual reproduction. Right? This is why we say there's a sex binary. And this is true across the animal kingdom. I was mentioning right before we jumped on that, during my lunch break, I was, outside moving sheep. And look, we have ewes and we have rams. And when a baby lamb is born, like it's really important to identify, is it a ewe or a ram? Is it a male or a female? This is true not just for the sheep. We have pigs, right? We have male pigs, female pigs. We have goats, we have cows, right? All of the various like livestock that we have out in our pasture, like it's binary and it's stable, right? The ewe doesn't become a ram and vice versa. There's not somewhere in between the two. Same thing is true for the human, right? And it's based upon how the organism is organized for sexual reproduction. And there are two ways of being organized for sexual reproduction. There's a male way, and that means you're organized to your body will produce the small gamete, and you will, in essence, donate the genetic material, and you will reproduce outside of your body. And there's a female way of being organized where your body produces the large gamete, you receive genetic material, and you reproduce inside of your body. Then there are disorders of sexual development where you have an incompletely developed male or female reproductive system. That's not a third reproductive system. There's not a third genital. There's not a third gamete. There's not a third sex organ. There's not a third reproductive system. Nor is there a spectrum between like the male and the female. There's not a spectrum between sperm and egg. There's not a spectrum between penis and vagina. Right? I mean, these are binary. They're stable. But like every other aspect of developmental biology, there can be disorders, right? Disorders of respiratory development is lung disease. Disorder of cardiac development is heart disease. There are also disorders of sexual development. And then the last thing that you had mentioned was like chimeras. I mean, this is a situation in which, let's say you have twins and then they merge. And this happens. This is how you get a human chimera, where you would have, two babies very early on. So like, at the embryonic stage, and then the two embryos more or less fuse. And then different parts of that. So if they were, a male embryo and a female embryo, and they fuse, and then the cell lines lead to the development of different parts of the body. You could have like one of your organ having the XX set of chromosomes,
Wow.
and then other, and that's why it's when you see, like, if you ever watch like crime shows and they're like, oh, the blood type was XX, but the criminal was XY. Criminal was a male, but it's simply because like you could have situations in which different parts of the body are functionally the outgrowth of different parts of that early two sets of cells. But even with
Now,
chimeras,
but is
you
that
either have a
common?
male or a female reproductive system, right? Because like the part of that very early embryo blastocyst, the part that the cells that then give rise to the creation of the reproductive system are either
Mhm.
coming from one or the other of the original embryos when they fused. So
Okay.
even if you
Now,
took like a skin sample and, let's say you took some of my skin and like, oh, this is an XX sets of chromosome, that doesn't mean that I'm somehow now a female. It's based on how the body is organized for reproduction. And there, the book discusses, I think it's like half a dozen concrete examples
yeah,
of different disorders of sexual development. Last thing I'll say, because then I know we want to get to more questions, is that
yeah.
whenever you hear someone in the context of transgender ideology talking
Mhm.
about disorders of sexual development or so-called intersex conditions, they are just throwing dust into the air, trying to confuse things. Because gender ideology, it's not about people who may or may not have a body that's incompletely developed sexually. These are people who have fully functional, well-developed bodies whose inner sense, right, either their thoughts or their feelings, or simply their chosen persona, is not in alignment with the body, right? It's not because of bodily confusion. It's because of emotional, mental, psychological, or simply volitional
Yeah.
confusion.
Yeah. And those disorders we're not talking extremely common things either,
No,
right? That's okay. I think that's a
I mean,
misunderstanding that
the
people
the
think that's
most
so common.
yeah, and I would say like various things get defined as disorders of sexual development, but like any like the more severe forms of disorders of sexual development, we're talking about like one in every 10,000 or one in every
Wow.
25,000, right? This is not the type of thing that's um, a common phenomenon.
Which is good, frankly.
Yeah.
So that is, yeah.
But
All
also, I
right.
mean,
Well,
these people, they recognize themselves, and others recognize them as the boys or the girls, the men or the women that they are. Like they're not.
interesting.
So like, I mean, like, and because like some of the disorders of sexual development, it's merely that they're infertile. So one form is like if you only have one sex chromosome.
Okay.
Let's say you only have an X, and you're just missing the second chromosome. It's called Turner syndrome, and you grow up to be an infertile woman because it takes two X chromosomes. You need both sets of genetic material to develop a full reproductive system. And
Interesting.
then
And
there are other conditions akin to that we could that I do discuss in the book. Um, but there's no confusion about the identity of these people. It's just that in this case, they suffer from infertility.
yeah, Billboard Chris last week was talking about it. Well, on one of his videos that I saw, that it's not that they're still males or females, just with a disorder, something that came
Yeah,
off of it, something that made
yeah.
it not consistent with um, a normal reproductive system. Okay, so this has been, I mean, I could talk to you all day about this, but I promised that we would get to audience chat. So why don't we have Kit bring up our first question, please? As the tree root cause, do you feel it is driven by monetary gain by pharmaceutical and medical industries? That's a great question. So what's really driving this?
Yeah, I mean, look, so I do think there is a financial component to this, but I wouldn't say that's the primary driver. When you read the kind of like biographies of the people who are pushing this the most, they are true believers. It's ideology. When you
Wow.
read kind of, I mean, in some cases, like some of the medical doctors who have pioneered the pediatric gender clinics are transgender themselves. And so it's a situation where they say to themselves, if only I would have transitioned younger, then I would be happier. Part of the logic here is that, look, it would be really hard for me as a 40-something-year-old man to now transition to become a woman. What are we going to do about my stubble, right? Electrolysis. What are we going to do with my knuckles? What are we going to do with my Adam's apple? But wait, had we done my transition before I went through male puberty? Had we put me on puberty blocking drugs? Had we then had me undergo on female puberty by giving me estrogen rather than allowing my body to produce testosterone, then my body would have been naturally feminized by going through female puberty, by doing puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, which then would have made subsequent surgery that much more successful because we would be, in essence, like working from a something more akin to a blank slate than working from like the male slate that I currently have, right? So that's the ideological logic behind this. And again, which is why it's not surprising that some of the medical doctors in the states who've been pushing this are transgender themselves.
Yeah.
Some of the donors, you look at something like the donor families, the foundations behind this, and there's someone in the family who identifies as transgender. Yes, there are some pharmaceutical companies, there are some hospitals that make money off of this. And I think that may be why, some of the administration is willing to turn, yeah, like, we're not crazy about this, but look, it makes a lot of money. It's a cash cow for the hospital or for the medical school. I think what's more often happened is that people who know that this is medically misguided have been cowed into silence. They looked at,
Interesting.
just this week, we saw that Alan Josephson won his case, and the University of Louisville had to pay a $1.6 million settlement for
Wow.
unjustly firing him. I got him fired. He spoke at an event that I hosted at Heritage back in 2017, right? So think about it. Back in 2017, very few people were willing to speak out, particularly a medical doctor. And he was a medical
Yeah.
professor. He was the chair of pediatric and adolescent psychiatry. And I needed a psychiatrist to say, what would you advise parents dealing
Yeah.
with this? And he spoke out. And then the next year they demoted him, and the year after that they fired him. And he
You
just won his justified dismissal lawsuit, $1.6 million settlement that University of Louisville had to pay. Well, a lot of people said to themselves, I don't want to be the next Alan Josephson, because there was
mhm.
no guarantee that he was going to win his case, right? And from the outside perspective, it was like, wow, for the past 7-8 years now, he's been unemployed. And there were a lot
Wow.
of medical doctors who would privately email me, text me, send me direct messages on Twitter saying, I love what you're doing. I'd be like, that's great. Can you say it out loud? Nope, I would lose my job. Right. And so I think there's part of this that the self-selected gender experts more or less then got to become the person that would set the policy for the rest of their hospital or their network or their university. And then people who thought better were like, it's not worth picking this fight because they were afraid that
Yeah.
they were going to lose. So anyway, but that's simply saying, I do think there's a financial aspect of this, but I don't think it's actually the driving one.
It's
I think there were
interesting.
true believers who believe the ideology, and I think this comes through. I mean, think about, we had a transgender deputy secretary of HHS during the Biden years, right?
Yeah,
And
that was
Admiral Levine was not doing this for the financial payoff, right? He
Yeah.
believes it because he is now living as if he is a she. And I think that's what motivates, for the 4 years that he was pushing this stuff. And before that, he was pushing it in the state of Pennsylvania. True believer, not, what's my bank account going to look like? Even though I do think there were people who went along with it for the bank
Well,
account.
so there I would say I think that maybe the higher ups, right, the elites, this is my
Mhm.
interpretation. I'm not saying this is yours and
Yeah.
anyone else's, but it feels like it's the more the elites that are pushing it at the money level, that they're convincing all the sheep, if you will, that, oh
Mhm.
yeah, this is absolutely something. So yes, I think that people are true believers, but I personally see a lot of nefarious um folks and uh, driving factors behind it. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I think, but
Well, and also,
I
I mean,
do think
especially
you're right that people
politically,
believe it.
I think especially politically, when some of the biggest donors were from the, I forget what the statistic was, but maybe it was 25% of Obama's bundlers were coming from like LGBT
I
sources.
didn't realize that.
So
Wow.
like if a quarter, I mean, you just think about the relative size of
Yeah.
the country, and especially this is now 15 years ago. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so yeah, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. I agree. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see our next question. Kit, what should we answer next? Why has gender dysphoria never exited before about 15 years ago? Others have been boylesque and others have been in Las Vegas for years, but not a one of the guys, and they identified as a girl. Wow. I don't think I've even ever heard of that. Is boylesque a, I'll let you answer this.
So I don't know the Boyle-esque reference there. Um, uh, but it was gender dysphoria has existed longer than 15 years ago, but it was originally
Oh, yeah.
defined as gender identity disorder. So the phrase gender dysphoria is what the DSM 4 and DSM 5, and then before that, I believe the change took place with 4. It's how they redefined what DSM 3 and 2 had referred to as gender identity disorder. So
Okay.
gender identity disorder became gender dysphoria. And I think if you go even further back in the history, it was at one point known as like trans fetishism or transvestitism, transvestite fetishism. I mean, so like
Yeah, we never hear
looking like
those words anymore.
yeah, at all. But if like you look back to like 1950s, how it was discussed, I mean, the first transgender surgery takes place over 100 years ago now.
Hmm.
And I mentioned that in the book.
Yep.
Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore they opened their sex reassignment clinic in the 1960s. And then Paul McHugh shut it down in the late 1970s. But at the time, the only people who experienced gender identity disorders were little boys, like prepubertal boys, who almost all just grew out of it, and then middle-aged men. And the middle-aged men, the term that Ronald Bailey, not Bailey, he was at Northwestern University. I'm blanking on the name right now, but the term that he used, Ray Blanchard, the term that Ray Blanchard coined was autogynephilia. And it's 3 Greek prefix kind of mushed together. Auto meaning self, gyna meaning woman, philia meaning love. And the idea was love of self as a woman. And so some people have speculated that this is the type of gender dysphoria that Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner, has, that Bruce wants to become the type of woman that either he finds arousing or that he thinks other people find arousing. And, when they saw the Vanity Fair cover shoot, I heard from a number of medical doctors who, they're not treating a patient. They're just, speculating about a public issue of discourse. We're saying, look, this would fit the pattern of autogynephilia, of a middle-aged man trying to present himself as the type of woman that either he or other people would find alluring, which is also why like one of the frequent male to female surgeries would involve top surgery but not bottom surgery, so that the
Oh,
patient could retain male sexual organs and therefore male sexual satisfaction below the belt, but then have female secondary sex characteristics above the belt. Um, all which is to say, so it's not quite accurate to say that this is only a phenomenon in the past 15 years. What it is worth pointing out, and I think what the question might be getting at, is that this happening to adolescent girls and women, that is a new phenomenon. Historically, this was little prepubertal boys and middle-aged men. And then the 4,400% increase that we saw, that data comes from the United Kingdom. It was all like high school and college age girls and women. And that, I think, there are cultural explanations that I think are worth thinking about. Lisa Littman, who was at Brown at the time, published her paper. The phrase was rapid onset gender dysphoria, saying that,
Hmm.
look, there are people with no history of gender conflicts all of a sudden rapidly having this onset gender dysphoria, and then it happens in like clusters. It's like a social contagion when like an
Yeah.
entire friend group will come out as trans, or more common, non-binary, gender fluid, gender ambidextrous. A lot of people have speculated that what this suggests is not that I'm a boy trapped in a girl's body, but I am rejecting societal standards of what it means to be a girl or a woman. And if you think about our culture today, it is very inhospitable to young women. Like we have
Really is.
and so anyway, so which is simply to say that, like, if I were coming of age today as a woman, it would be entirely understandable why I would just say, no, I'm rejecting it. I'm not rushing to be a boy. I'm just going to opt out. I'm non-binary. I'm,
I
etc.
That was something that was honestly a little bit challenging for me to understand when I was researching this because
Mm.
I definitely experienced this purely personal experience that I had issues with who didn't have issues with puberty
Right.
and feel uncomfortable and strange, but I never felt, I don't think, like this absolute attack that I have uncovered stories in researching this topic, and it really is sad to see that women feel this way, but it totally makes sense. And I will say, like I said it earlier, I personally feel that this is such an attack on women and just a dismissal of our rights that now men, I mean, it was a joke, right? When Bruce Jenner was named Woman of the Year, Caitlyn Jenner was named Woman of the Year,
Yep.
that, oh, men are so good at, they're so much better at everything else than women. They're even better at being women
Being
than
women.
women. And it was such an offensive joke, but like so factual at the
Yep.
moment. And the fact that people couldn't see that and how offensive it was is just awful.
And let me just jump on that to say that, I mean, one of the things that really motivated me to say the book needs to get written, was, I had known Walt Heyer, and, Walt is a man who
Wow.
transitioned, I think when he was in his 50s, and then detransitioned 8 years later. And, now he's in his 80s right now, and he looks good, like he's
Yeah.
healthy. Um, and like Walt's story is tragic. And I had an
Yeah.
email correspondence with him, and then we see each other about once or twice a year for the past decade now. Um, but it was when I started doing research on this, and no one had yet gone public the way that someone like Chloe Cole has now gone public. But I found all of these chat board, what do you like, just blogging type, chat board back a decade ago is what it was in essence, and then YouTube videos of young women who were like, I've transitioned and I've detransitioned and I'm all alone. And it was just heartbreaking. And I think like that's what I found most like, I have to say something, because it really was this situation in which you had these like young women. Puberty is difficult under the best of circumstances. They're going through puberty in a very inhospitable time and space, and they think the problem is them, not the hostile culture. And they're now doing things to their bodies that will permanently, um, irreversible damage. I think it's such a good title for
Yeah.
Abigail's book, and no one at the time was speaking up for them. Um,
Yeah. Oh my God. I'm glad you did it. And I just want to give a plug. I know we're talking about it, but truly, if folks are interested on the topic, they really should read it because it's soup to nuts. I think you cover everything so well in the book.
thank you.
Kit, can we have another question? I know we're running out of time. I'm just going to try to get more in. Is part of the answer giving detransitioners a bigger platform? Oh, that's a great
Yes,
question.
without a doubt. Um, anyone who hears Chloe speak in person, or for that matter, Prisha, or there are a variety of young women.
There's many.
They are so powerful. I mean, I can remember being in the room. I can't say where because it was an off the record conference, but some of the people on this call were probably there. I know Kit was there. Everyone was tearing up, not a dry out eye in the audience. And there were probably like 200 of us there. And these were people who had been working on this issue for a number of years. And still, when you hear the first person testimony of how this ideology and then this medical industry victimized and harmed these young people, it just I can't even describe it. Like you just have to hear it for yourself. So the answer to the question is yes. Anything we can do to give these people platforms, we should do. And then the other thing I'll add, eventually one of their lawsuits will succeed. And I think that
Yeah.
is what's going to bring this medical scandal to a close. And this is what
That's,
Paul McHugh had predicted decades ago. I remember talking to Paul with when Paul's saying, look, the way this is going to end, eventually one of these young people is going to sue. And then the
wow.
hospital is going to say, wow, do we really want to put our pediatric oncology program at risk because our pediatric gender clinic just got sued and has like a multi-million-dollar payout, and now we can't get medical malpractice insurance, or our rates are going through the roof, et cetera, et cetera. So I think like giving them both a platform, but then also like the lawyers who are taking on these cases, Campbell Payne Miller is one of the firms doing it. There are a couple other, like they are doing like just like heroes work right now. And eventually one of them will succeed. And I think that'll get the wake up call, because like the lawyers and the insurance brokers are going to, more or less go to the administrators and say, do you really want to keep doing this? Because this is
Yeah.
what it's costing us.
Yep. Hit them where it hurts. Money is
Yes.
it really I see, this is why I feel like it does always just come back to money,
Yeah.
unfortunately, because people, it always comes back to money, it seems. So that really ties into one of our previously submitted questions, or pre-submitted questions, I should say, that, and this is a pretty new topic. We just had the UK passing a law, speaking of legal,
Mhm.
acknowledging the definition of a woman, which is
Yep.
so fantastic and felt like just a huge win. And also, by the way, when I read that and I thought, wow, what a great win. I was like, what world am I living in that I'm excited that we are acknowledging an adult human female?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what do you think are the implications of this decision? How close is the US to, are we even close in the US to coming to actually passing a law?
Um, no. So the latter part of that is, so long as the legislative filibuster is still in place, it takes 60 votes to get anything that's not directly tied to the budget out of the Senate, right? And so they
Oh
can go
wow.
through like a budget reconciliation where they only need a simple majority, and that's where you get like the must pass pieces of legislation, stuff like this. This is all like dorky, like DC procedural talk. But in general, like because of the filibuster, and the filibuster is good because it prevents a lot of bad stuff from happening.
Yeah.
Whenever the Democrats have a 51 person majority, you don't want them to be able to pass whatever they want to pass. So the legislative filibuster is actually, I think, a net a force for good. But as a result, we're not close. If I was Majority Leader Thune, every month I would bring this bill to the floor and force the Democrats to vote against it. And then during the midterm
Great.
elections, I would run against until, and this is how I would build my 60 vote majority, because this is a losing issue for the Dems.
Mm-hmm.
The reason Trump ran the she's for they, them, he's for you commercial, this resonates. This is a
Yep.
70-30 or an 80-20 issue. Now, we do have a whole host of executive orders, right? The day one executive order saying that it's only
Mm-hmm.
male and female. Then we got subsequent executive orders ending pediatric mutilation. Remember, one was
Thank
focused on
God.
the medicine. We had stuff focused no boys and girls sports executive order. So we have a variety of things that will govern the federal government for the next 4 years. And that's all an
Yeah.
executive order can do, right? An executive order is the president telling everyone else in the executive branch, this is how it's going to be. But that means 4 years from now, if we have a terrible left-wing president, they could bring it back.
Yeah.
That said,
And they
I
do
think
that.
it would be political suicide. And you already see the governor of California going on
Oh
podcasts
yeah.
and walking back from the
Yeah.
girls' sports issue, even though he like championed the
Yeah,
putting men in women's prisons issue, right? I mean, and just realize that is also an injustice. The fact that there
that's
are
hugely.
women who have been sexually assaulted by men who were sent to jail because they were rapists being transferred to lady jail. It's insane.
Yeah.
The UK will no longer be doing any of that, right? I mean, that's part of like what that UK ruling is going to entail. Um, we have an important Supreme Court case. Oral arguments were heard at the beginning of the year. This is it's
The
not Alabama.
Carmody,
What states? This is the Scarametti case. I forget which state it comes out
Mhm.
of. Maybe
Tennessee. I think
Tennessee.
that's Tennessee.
Yeah. But this was the ban on pediatric uh, sex transition procedures. I think the Supreme Court upholds that, which will then allow every red state that has a law like this, and I think we're now almost up to 30 states that either
Wow.
have a female sports bill or a child medicine bill. It's in the high 20s. Those will, I think, will be upheld. The federal government will have its own version of this through executive order, but I don't think we're going to get the federal legislation so long as the filibuster's in place.
I heard someone, I was listening to a different podcast about it, and they presented the idea that because like the UK is a smaller country, it's
Mhm.
easier to have a law passed at the country national level for them, whereas in America we're so big
Yeah.
that it is really down to the state level, and that's why you see some states going way one way and some states going way the other way. And I thought that was a really interesting
Yep.
perspective because I hadn't really thought of it at that in that way before.
Yep.
Okay, so I know we're right at the end, but if we could get maybe one more question, Kit, see if we
Sure.
can squeeze one more in. Ryan, do you believe that there are actually boys who are ROGD, so rapid onset gender dysphoria as well? I don't believe my now 23-year-old son is gay or AGP. I think he is also rejecting what society expects from men. My
Yeah.
son is autistic, as many of these young people are. That is so sad, by the way.
Yeah.
That is such an attack on such a vulnerable group.
Um, so a couple of things to say there. One is that there's almost certainly, and I can't say certainly because like none of this is actually all that well understood. There's very little like good empirical research on any of this, right? It's all experimental. It's all under researched. But many people who I trust think there is a link between autism and gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
And the rapid onset gender dysphoria was more heavily a female phenomenon, but that doesn't mean it was an exclusively a female phenomenon. There are high school boys and college age men who are identifying as non-binary or transgender. I mean, think about Leah Thomas, right? Obviously, this is a
Mhm.
man who's identifying as a woman, right? So it's not exclusively female. Um, the reason that people have pointed out an autism connection here is that one of the attributes of people with somewhere on the autism spectrum is that they can be very focused on almost obsessively focused on particularities. And so if someone on the autism spectrum gets it in their head that like what it means to be a boy is GI Joe, and I don't like GI Joe, therefore, right, and then you can fill in the blank, I'm a girl or I'm non-binary, but there's something. And so it's like almost like that obsession over, in this case, a certain narrow definition of what real boyhood or girlhood looks like, that someone that already has autism would be more prone to then also have it manifest itself in the gender context. But I think you're right. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's gay or that he quote is transgender. I don't even think it's accurate to say that anyone is transgender, or for that matter, that anyone is gay. I mean, I think there are people with same-sex attractions. There are people with gender dysphoria. There are people who identify as non-binary or the opposite sex, but no one is any of those things. Right? I think it's a problem, and it was intentional that the left used the more ontological language because
Interesting.
arguing about who someone is much more powerful than about how someone identifies. And so I think it's in the second chapter of the book. I go
Yep.
through historically. You look at what the LGBT guidebooks said in the 90s and the early 2000s about the T. A transgender person is someone who identifies as the opposite sex. That's like a quote from some of these left-leaning publications. And then a decade later, a transgender person is someone who is, the gender with which they identify. or someone who is a trans woman is a woman, rather than a trans woman is a man who identifies as a woman. And that change was intentional. And so we should not allow the left to co-opt our own language or our own thinking, right?
Hmm.
And when we start thinking in their structures, oh, my son is trans or is gay, right? That is their framing of it, rather than saying, my son struggles with his identity in general, and then in particular with respect to his sexuality, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I feel like whenever I meet parents that have children struggling in this way, like my heart breaks, because like it's a difficult, sensitive issue. And there's only so much, especially if your son is now 23, that the parent can do. Because frequently that's like, the children are doing this. When I was a kid, we would go through a rebellious stage, and, some of us
Yeah.
went goth, right? And I had
Yeah.
friends that painted their nails black and they wore dark trench coats. And a year or two later, when they grew out of it, there was no lasting harm. Whereas now, like, kids are going through a rebellious stage, or they're just, struggling to fit in. And like the way that they're then responding is, with some of the trans ideology. And then when it takes on a medicalized treatment, it's much more serious than just painting your fingernails black or wearing a dark trench coat.
Yeah. I completely agree. And I apologize, everyone, if I cut out for a second there. It looks like my internet got a little bit wonky for a minute. But if you, I know we're over time. Do you have time to give anyone just like give our viewers just like the key talking points? What are the key takeaways? What's a simplistic, not simplistic, that's not the right word. When for mom standing in line at the grocery store or talking to another parent at a soccer game, what would be the most straightforward or important points to remember if this topic comes up?
Oh, geez. There's so much to say there. I mean, part of it, what I have found to be most effective is actually asking questions. Well, what do you mean by
Mm,
that? Tell me more when you say that your son is a girl, because like, what does it feel like to feel like a girl, right? Why would feeling like a girl make you a girl? Like, how do I know if I'm feeling like a girl, right? Even if I was feeling like a girl, why would that make me a girl? Maybe I just have misguided feelings. I have feelings that aren't in keeping with reality. Um, I would point out that, wait a minute, every secular European country is turning on this, right? This isn't some like, no, this is just the Bible Belt of America that's rejecting this, right? America is the outlier in that we're still doubling down on this, when like all these Scandinavian countries and like post-Christian European countries are rejecting gender ideology. They're pumping the brakes as we're like flooring the gas pedal. Just making sure people are aware of this, like aware of the reality, that some of the countries that pioneered this treatment protocol are now questioning it. The Alabama amicus brief in this committee case, like, there was collusion between the medical doctors and the social justice lawyers, like letting people know that, look, this isn't just like trust the science. These are like doctors and scientists who were colluding with politicians and lawyers to cook the books. This is a medical scandal. Akin to, I mean, I imagine people have a variety of views about some of the COVID stuff, but like, if you think there were some shenanigans there are even more shenanigans here. Um,
yeah.
and then
Well,
the
I think
last
we,
thing I would say, encourage people to watch the videos of the detransitioners. Ask people if it's fair that this girl is standing on second spot on the podium rather than the first spot, because there's a boy standing there. Ask them if it's fair that there are inmates who have been sexually assaulted because men were transferred to their prisons, right? I mean, make them defend the hard cases,
yeah,
right? The
the
pediatric
emotional stuff.
surgery is the sports, and then the safe spaces.
I think that's great. That's questions. I want to encourage everyone. That is so critical. I will also just say buy the book too, because it's really helpful and gives you lots of good tips, advice, background. Really, like I said, lays out all the information in such an easy heck. Read the introduction. You do such a good job in the
Thank
introduction
you.
of doing like an overview of it. So if folks are questioning it, it at least helps you understand like the overview of the concept itself and everything that's happening. That the your point on questions too, also that helps people to it helps you to think of a response. It gives you time instead of immediately responding in an emotion. It gives you a minute. And also it makes sure that you're answering the actual issue that's being raised as
Yeah.
opposed to what you assume is the issue being raised. So I think that's so
Mhm.
important.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. This has been absolutely incredible. Like I said, I could talk to you forever about this because this topic is just wild to me.
Mhm.
But take a minute, and if you could tell our viewers where they can find you, follow you, and hear more, because you have so many good debates and presentations you've done. So where can folks find you on social media?
Sure. So my Twitter is at Ryan T and so RyanTand. Um, you can actually, I don't know if you go to the Ethics and Public Policy Center's website, so eppc.org, and then you look up for my scholar page, you'll see essays that I've written, media appearances, things like this. A lot of that stuff was written before I became president. So I don't have like my own website that just compiles everything. Google can be your friend. YouTube, if you search for my name and transgender, I was just at Yale University a couple weeks ago. I was at Grove City College a little bit before that. So you can find like recent debates. You can also find like the very first lecture I ever gave on this topic from 8 years ago. C-SPAN recorded it, and so you can find like the
Oh, wow.
C-SPAN discussion. Yeah, because again, like back at the time, no one else was doing this. Um,
Yeah.
and then Amazon currently sells all of the books I've written. So there's some other books out there in addition to this one. Um, and that'll get you started. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much. I know
Yeah.
we
Thank
all
you.
really appreciate you having you here. All
Yeah.
right.
No, pleasure to do it.
Well, Well, Joyful Warriors, this was fantastic. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I clearly could have just talked about this all day. This topic is unbelievable to me. It's incredible that we even have to have a debate about what is a woman and a man, but we do. And language is so important. It's so critical that you are clear with your language and being precise. So, just a quick recap on what we've had so far this month. The topic has been gender ideology. We had Gender 101 lecture with three great speakers. Gender 102, we featured Billboard Chris and Jay Richards, who you heard a little bit about from Ryan today. Today was our book club discussion with Ryan Anderson, and this one is missing the title. We didn't get I don't have an updated one here, but next week on Tuesday, the 29th at 6:30, we will be watching No Way Back, the reality of gender affirming care, and you do not want to miss that movie. It is absolutely incredible. We are featuring two of the producers, Joey Bright and Stephanie Wynn, who is actually a therapist and host for the podcast Some Kind of Therapist. It's really fantastic, and you don't want to miss that and get a chance to speak with them as well. And finally, next month, we are going to be coming to a really, if you think gender ideology is bad, I can tell you without question, comprehensive sex ed, or in reality, comprehensive sexuality education is what we'll be learning about in May. And that is just an Oh, it is a cesspit of crazy that we are going to be uncovering. So you don't want to miss those. We have some amazing speakers lined up already. So I cannot wait to bring that to you. Thank you all again. And as you know, the importance or the mission of M4LU is to inform, equip, and empower you to fight back. Thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you on our future events.